My name is Kayla Smith, and my life changed dramatically 6 months ago. I inherited a beautiful house from my beloved grandmother. I remember the day I received the news as if it were yesterday. I was in my small apartment in the city, reviewing architectural plans for a project I was working on. When the phone rang, I answered without taking my eyes off the blueprints. The lawyer, John Brown, called to inform me that my grandmother, Nancy Smith, had passed away. In that moment, I felt as if the world had stopped turning. Grandma Nancy had been like a second mother to me. I spent my childhood summers at her house, learning to cook and listening to her stories from the past. It took me several seconds to process when the lawyer told me that Nancy had named me as the sole heir to her property. I could barely whisper the words, asking if she had really left me her house. The lawyer confirmed that everything, the house and all its contents, now belonged to me. After hanging up the phone, I sank into my sofa, overwhelmed by a mix of grief and shock. While my grandmother's death left a deep ache in my heart, I also felt a strange elation about inheriting that beautiful house filled with memories. That evening when my husband Robert came home, I shared the news with him. Robert hugged me tightly, exclaiming what an incredible opportunity this was. He told me we could move into the house and start a new life. I saw the excitement sparkling in Robert's eyes. Though we had grown fond of our small apartment where we'd lived for 5 years since our marriage, the idea of living in that beautiful, spacious house was appealing. I asked him if he was sure, reminding him that we would both need to leave our current jobs and start over. Robert took my hands in his, assuring me that as an accountant, he could find work anywhere. He reminded me that I had always wanted to open my own architectural firm, suggesting this might be my chance. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself starting to imagine our new life. We spent the next few weeks immersed in moving preparations. We packed our belongings, said goodbye to friends and family, and finally moved on a beautiful spring day. The house was even more beautiful than I remembered, with a courtyard full of blooming flowers and a small fountain. The white walls created a striking contrast with the colorful tiles and wrought iron window grilles. When we entered, the familiar scent of jasmine and orange trees transported me back to my childhood. I whispered, "Perfect," while squeezing Robert's hand. Those first few days flew by in a whirlwind of unpacking, rearranging furniture, and exploring the neighborhood. Grandmother's memories filled every corner of the house. Her collection of old books in the study, her paintings on the walls, even the old sewing machine in the attic, everything seemed to hold her presence and welcome us. Robert and I quickly settled into life in this house. Robert found a job at a local accounting firm, and I started planning to open my own architectural office. We spent our afternoons walking in the nearby park and enjoying tea at local cafes. We felt blessed and full of hope for the future. However, our happiness didn't last long. Just 2 weeks after moving in, while I was preparing lunch in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Wiping my hands on my apron, I walked to the door. When I opened it, there stood my mother-in-law, Deborah. She was a stout woman in her 60s with dyed blonde hair and a perpetually dissatisfied expression on her face. Next to her was my sister-in-law Nicole, who looked like a younger version of Deborah, holding a baby. Behind them, 2 small children were hiding shyly. Deborah pushed past me into the house, exclaiming how long it had been since we'd last met. I stood there, stunned as they all flooded into the entrance hall, barely managing to stammer out a greeting. Nicole kissed my cheek as she walked past me, casually announcing they would be staying for a while. I felt as if I'd been punched in the stomach. When I asked about the length of their stay, Deborah, who was already inspecting the living room, turned to me with a cold smile. She dismissed my question and asked where Robert was. As if on cue, Robert returned from shopping at that moment. His expression changed from surprise to joy in seconds. He hugged his mother and sister, asking why they were here. Deborah stroked her son's cheek, explaining that they needed a place to stay because Nicole had fought with her husband. I watched Robert's face, hoping to see the same confusion and concern I felt. To my surprise, he was beaming with happiness. He immediately welcomed them to stay, asking for my agreement while everyone turned to look at me. I forced a smile and said of course they could stay, while inside I was screaming no. The days that followed were chaos. Our once spacious and quiet house was suddenly filled with constant noise and commotion. Nicole's children, aged 3 and 7, ran through the house, touching everything and making messes. Nicole spent most of her time on the sofa, watching TV and complaining about her husband. Meanwhile, Deborah took over the kitchen, subtly criticizing every aspect of my housekeeping. As she reorganized my kitchen cabinets, she told me how fortunate it was that they had come, saying the house needed a real woman's touch. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that they were Robert's family and needed our help. But each day, it became increasingly difficult. My daily routine was completely disrupted. I couldn't focus on work with constant interruptions and noise. Meals became a battlefield, with Deborah insisting on elaborate cooking that took hours and left mountains of dirty dishes. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found Robert drinking beer in the kitchen. I approached him, trying to keep my voice steady, asking if he knew how long his mother and Nicole planned to stay. He looked at me with surprise, asking if their presence was bothering me. I took a deep breath before responding. I explained that while I wouldn't call it bothersome, the situation was negatively affecting our lives. I told him I couldn't concentrate on work, the house was always messy, and honestly, I felt uncomfortable in my own home. Robert frowned, telling me they were his family and needed help, we couldn't throw them out. I argued that I wasn't suggesting throwing them out, I just wanted to know how long they planned to stay. Robert seemed offended, reminding me that family comes first. With those words, he stood up and left me alone in the kitchen. I stood there, gazing through the window at the courtyard that had once seemed so beautiful and full of possibility. Now toys were scattered everywhere, and laundry hung on lines Deborah had installed, symbolizing how I had lost control of my life. That night, lying in bed next to Robert, who was already snoring quietly, I found myself lost in thought. How had things come to this? The house that was supposed to be the start of an exciting new life had become a source of stress and tension. What had initially seemed like a blessing from my grandmother now felt like a curse. As Robert's snores mingled with the distant crying of Nicole's baby, a sense of despair washed over me. I wondered how I could regain control of my life and my home. Was it selfish to want my own space and peace? These unanswerable questions kept spinning in my mind. At that time, I didn't know this was just the beginning of a test of my patience, my marriage, and my identity. That afternoon's family invasion was about to spark a storm that would forever change the course of my life. Days turned into weeks, and weeks became a full month. Every morning I woke up hoping today would be the day Deborah would announce their departure, but that hope vanished the moment I saw her in the kitchen, making breakfast as if she owned the place. Meanwhile, Nicole seemed to have taken permanent residence on the sofa, alternating between crying about her failed marriage and scolding her children. One afternoon, while I was trying to concentrate on an important project in my makeshift office in the attic, I heard Deborah calling from downstairs. Her authoritative tone made me shiver as she demanded I come down immediately, saying she needed to talk. I sighed in resignation, put away my blueprints, and descended the stairs, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. She was sitting in the living room, with a cup of tea, wearing a serious expression. Nicole sat beside her, with tear-stained eyes. Deborah pointed to the chair in front of her and commanded me to sit down. I sat down, feeling anxiety building in my stomach. When I asked what this was about, Deborah took a sip of tea before speaking, as if delivering a rehearsed speech. She told me they had been thinking and had reached a conclusion. She paused, and I waited for her to continue while the silence in the room was so thick I could hear the wall clock ticking. Finally, Deborah announced that she thought it would be best if Robert and I moved to a rental apartment. She explained that this house would be perfect for Nicole and her children, who needed a place to live and stability. I felt as if I had been doused with cold water. I could barely whisper the words, "What did you say?" in my disbelief. Deborah continued in a tone that suggested she was being perfectly reasonable, telling me to think about it. She explained that Nicole was in a difficult situation and her children needed a stable home, suggesting that since we were a young couple, we could easily adapt to a small apartment. My disbelief quickly turned to anger. I protested, my voice trembling slightly, reminding them that this was my house. I emphasized that I had inherited it from my grandmother, asking why we should be the ones to leave. Nicole, who had been silent until then, interrupted with a tearful plea. She begged me to think about her children, saying they had nowhere else to go. I looked back and forth between Deborah and Nicole, trying to comprehend this situation. I couldn't understand how we had gotten to this point, how they could demand I leave my own house. Standing up, I told them this was ridiculous. I firmly stated that I had no intention of moving out of my own house, suggesting they could find another solution if they needed help. I reminded them that this was my and Robert's home. Deborah also stood up, her expression hardening. She reminded me that family comes first, asserting that Robert would understand this. Suddenly, realizing my husband's absence from this important conversation, I asked if they had discussed this with Robert. Deborah admitted they had not yet told him, but she was confident he would agree because they were his family. I felt anger and determination rising inside me. As I headed for the door, I told them we would discuss this when Robert returned from work. I ignored Deborah's calls and Nicole's renewed sobbing as I left the room. I went out to the courtyard and sat on the edge of the fountain, trying to calm my ragged breathing. The next few hours felt like torture. My anxiety grew with each passing minute. When I heard Robert's key in the front door, my heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I ran to him, calling his name and telling him we needed to talk right away. The look of surprise on his face told me he already knew what was happening. Deborah must have called him. He tried to embrace me, telling me to calm down. I pushed him away. I demanded to know if he knew that his mother and sister were telling us to leave our own house. Robert sighed and ran his fingers through his hair. He told me his mother had called an hour ago to explain the situation. I repeated the word "a situation" in disbelief. I asked him what situation he was talking about, reminding him this was our house, the house my grandmother had left to me, questioning why we should be the ones to leave. He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and determination. He asked me to understand, explaining that Nicole was in a very difficult situation and her children needed stability. I could not believe my ears. I asked about us, our future, our dreams, demanding to know if none of that mattered. Robert stepped closer, assuring me that of course it mattered. But then he insisted that family comes first, and they couldn't abandon them. I felt as if the ground was splitting beneath my feet. I asked if he agreed with them, if he really thought we should leave our own house. Robert avoided my eyes, and that was all the answer I needed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, taking a step back from Robert in disbelief. I asked him how he could betray me like this. Robert tried to take my hand, protesting that it wasn't betrayal. He insisted this was the right thing to do, promising it would only be temporary until Nicole got back on her feet and found her own place. But I had stopped listening to his words, which now sounded hollow and meaningless. In that moment, looking into the eyes of the man I had married, I realized I had no allies. The person who was supposed to be my strongest supporter had betrayed me in the most painful way. I whispered that I needed to be alone and left the room. The following days were filled with arguments, tears, and uncomfortable silences. Robert kept trying to convince me about the importance of family, alternating between pleading and arguing. Deborah and Nicole were already behaving as if it was a done deal, discussing their plans for reorganizing the house after we left. I felt like a stranger in my own home, avoiding common areas and eating at odd hours to avoid running into anyone. My work had come to a standstill as I couldn't focus on architectural projects, while my life was falling apart. One sleepless night, I got up and went to my grandmother's study, the only place in the house that Deborah and Nicole hadn't invaded yet. I turned on the desk lamp and looked around the room, remembering Grandma sitting in that chair, telling me stories about her youth, teaching me about perspective and balance while I drew. That's when I found it, a small envelope hidden between the books. I pulled it from the bookshelf, immediately recognizing my grandmother's handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. My grandmother's letter told me that if I was reading this, she had passed away and I had inherited the house. She wanted me to know that I had always been her greatest pride and joy. She wrote that this house had been a witness to generations of strong women in our family, and she knew I would carry on that tradition. She reminded me not to forget who I was and to never let anyone make me doubt my worth or my rights. She said that while the house was mine, what mattered more was that my life was my own. She urged me to make decisions that would bring me happiness and growth, signing it with love. As I read the letter over and over, tears streamed down my cheeks. It felt as though my grandmother was giving me the strength I needed from beyond this world. Her words echoed in my heart, reminding me to never let anyone make me doubt my worth or my rights. In that moment, something changed within me. My sadness and confusion transformed into fierce determination. I would not allow myself to be pushed out of my own home. I refused to be a victim of this situation. Pressing my grandmother's letter to my chest, I made my decision. The time had come to fight for what was mine, my dreams, and my dignity. Though I didn't yet know how to accomplish it, one thing was certain. This would not end with my surrender. That night, I began formulating my plan, one that would change the course of my life and test my strength. The old Kayla, who allowed herself to be trampled on and manipulated, was gone. In her place stood a new Kayla, determined to take control of her own destiny. The days following my discovery of grandmother's letter were filled with a whirlwind of emotions and deep introspection. Each morning I woke with a mixture of determination and fear, knowing that my upcoming decisions would forever change my life. I spent hours in grandmother's study, weighing my options over and over again. The weight of the situation was crushing me. On one side was my marriage to Robert, years of love and promises, and on the other, my dignity and grandmother's legacy. Her words from the letter constantly echoed in my mind, telling me to never let anyone doubt my worth or my rights. Finally, after sleepless nights and days of anguish, I made the biggest decision of my life. I would divorce Robert. On the morning I decided to take action, I woke up earlier than everyone else. I carefully chose my clothes, putting on a suit that made me feel strong and confident. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, her eyes filled with determination I had never seen before. I quietly left the house and headed to the lawyer's office I had contacted a few days earlier. We spent hours discussing the details of the divorce proceedings. With each document I signed, I felt one chapter of my life coming to an end. The lawyer peered at me over his glasses and asked if I was sure this was what I wanted. I took a deep breath and answered that I was certain, as I had already made my decision. On my way home, the divorce papers felt as heavy as lead in my bag. I entered the house quietly, prepared to avoid Deborah and Nicole, but surprisingly, the house was unusually quiet. I found Robert alone in the kitchen drinking coffee. When he saw me, his expression turned worried. He asked where I had been, saying he had been concerned. For a moment, I wavered at the familiar warmth in his voice and his presence, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But then I remembered the past few weeks, how he had betrayed me and failed to support me. I gathered my courage. I told him we needed to talk, my voice stronger than I had expected. He nodded and followed me to the study. Once inside, I closed the door and turned to face him. My heart was beating so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. Robert said in a worried voice that something seemed wrong and he was scared. I took a deep breath and pulled the papers from my bag. I told him I wanted a divorce. The silence that followed was heavy and oppressive. Robert looked at the papers, then at me, then back at the papers. His expression changed from confusion to shock, and then to something I hadn't expected, an amused look. An unbelieving laugh escaped from his lips. He asked if this was a joke, suggesting I couldn't be serious. His response threw me for a moment, but I remained firm. I told him I had never been more serious in my life and that I couldn't continue this marriage. He came closer and tried to take my hand. He acknowledged that the past few weeks had been difficult but called this madness, saying I couldn't decide on divorce so easily. I asked him why not, reminding him that he had decided we would leave this house without consulting me, and that he had said family was more important than marriage. Robert shook his head, and his condescending smile made my blood boil. He told me I was being irrational and that this was just a temporary confusion I would soon regret. His patronizing and contemptuous attitude made me respond sharply, asking him how he could be so sure and if he understood what divorce meant. I kept my voice as steady as possible as I told him I had spoken with a lawyer and knew exactly what I was doing. Robert let out a laugh that chilled my blood. In a tone full of contempt, he said I would never have the courage to go through with it, asking where I would live and how I would survive without him. His words hit me like a slap, and I wondered if he really thought I was that weak and dependent on him. With my voice trembling with controlled anger, I reminded him that this was my house and that I could take care of myself without him. Robert came closer, his expression now serious. He warned me to think carefully, saying I would be alone without him, that his family wouldn't help me, questioning if I thought I could run an architectural firm alone, and who would take me seriously without him. Each word cut like a knife, revealing the true nature of our marriage. I wondered how I had married someone who could dismiss me so completely. To my own surprise, I found myself responding in a strong voice that I didn't need his permission to succeed or his approval to live my life. His expression changed as his mockery turned to anger. He declared he wouldn't sign the papers, telling me I was making a huge mistake. I told him my only mistake was believing he would support me and be my partner while retrieving the papers from his hand. I assured him I would find a way to accomplish this with or without his cooperation. I left the study, leaving Robert standing there with his mouth open. My heart was pounding, adrenaline and fear coursing through my veins, knowing the battle had just begun. Yet for the first time in weeks, I felt strong. The following days were hellish. Robert alternated between attempts at persuasion and fits of anger. When Deborah and Nicole learned of my intention to divorce, they doubled their efforts to make me feel worthless and incompetent. One afternoon, Deborah exclaimed with a voice full of contempt about the divorce, asking who I thought I was and saying I should be grateful her son had married me. Meanwhile, Nicole was desperate to show me how difficult life would become without Robert. She warned me that I didn't understand what it meant to be alone, advising me against divorce with feigned concern. Yet each hurtful word and every manipulative attempt only strengthened my resolve. One night, unable to bear the tension in the house any longer, I went for a walk. My feet led me to the park where Robert and I used to walk when we first moved here. I sat on a bench, watching couples and families enjoying the spring evening. An elderly woman sat down beside me and smiled kindly. In a warm, comforting voice, she noted that I seemed troubled. For some reason I couldn't explain, I found myself telling this stranger everything. She listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When I finished speaking, she looked at me with eyes full of understanding and strength. Taking my hands in hers, she told me she understood. She explained that life sometimes presents us with challenges that seem insurmountable, but these very trials reveal who we truly are. Her words resonated deeply within me. In a small voice, I admitted I was scared. She acknowledged that fear was natural, but warned me not to look away from it. She assured me I was stronger than I thought, suggesting there was a reason my grandmother had left me the house. She believed my grandmother had seen strength in me that I hadn't yet recognized. As I listened to her words, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. This stranger had understood in minutes what I had been struggling to recognize for weeks. With tears of gratitude in my eyes, I thanked her. She smiled, squeezed my hand once more, and stood up. She reminded me that true strength isn't about not feeling fear, but about facing it. I watched as she disappeared among the park trees. Her words ignited something within me, a spark of hope and determination that had been missing for too long. That night, I returned home with a new perspective, no longer as a victim of circumstances, but as the architect of my own destiny. As I climbed the stairs to my room, ignoring Deborah and Nicole's curious eyes, I made my decision. I would fight not just for the divorce, but to reclaim every aspect of my life I had gradually surrendered over the years. I entered my room and took out my notebook to write down my plans. I made a list of everything I wanted to achieve, starting with finalizing my divorce, establishing my own architectural firm, traveling, and learning new skills. As I wrote detailed plans for achieving each goal, it felt like I was drafting blueprints for my new life. Each word on the paper became a building block for the woman I was meant to become. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, blending with the words of the woman from the park, reminding me that I was stronger than I thought. The next morning, I woke up earlier than anyone else in the house. I carefully chose clothes that made me feel powerful and confident. I left without saying a word to anyone, heading to meet with my lawyer to discuss the next steps in my divorce proceedings. This meeting wasn't just about divorce paperwork. It was an appointment with my future. For the first time in my life, I felt a future full of bright possibilities ahead of me. Robert's mocking response from that day, rather than discouraging me, had ignited an unstoppable fire of determination within me. I knew the path to freedom and self-realization wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, doubts, and moments of weakness. But I was ready to face them all because I now knew the truth. I wasn't just inheriting a house, I was the heir to a legacy of strong, brave women. I made the decision to sell the house. The proceeds would help me not only finance my divorce from Robert but also start a new life on my own terms. The following days were filled with secret activities. While pretending to maintain my normal routine, I spent every spare moment organizing documents, coordinating with real estate agents and lawyers, and preparing the house for professional photographs. One afternoon, while I was reviewing the contract from the real estate agent in the study, I heard footsteps approaching. I quickly hid the documents in the drawer just before Robert entered. When Robert questioned why I was spending all day cooped up in here, his tone mixing curiosity with suspicion. I smoothly lied, telling him I was working on some architectural designs and thinking about entering a competition. Although Robert seemed to accept my explanation, I could see doubt lingering in his eyes. As the house sale process progressed, I felt the need to be increasingly cautious. It was like living a double life. On one side, I was playing the role of the submissive, defeated Kayla that Robert and his family believed they had subjugated, while on the other, I was secretly the Kayla who was working to dramatically change her life. The strain of maintaining this facade was exhausting. Yet every morning, I woke up with renewed determination. My grandmother's voice kept echoing in my mind, telling me I was stronger than I thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I received the call I had been waiting for. The real estate agent told me with excitement that they had received an offer on the house, which was even higher than we had anticipated. They explained that an overseas buyer had fallen in love with the house's history and was prepared to pay in cash, with the sale potentially closing within days. My legs trembled beneath me, as I realized this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. With a shaking voice, I gave my approval to proceed with the sale. The next few days passed in such a blur of paperwork and negotiations that I barely remember what I was doing. Each time I signed a document, I felt like I was taking another step toward freedom, yet I also felt a knot in my stomach. I knew confronting Robert and his family wouldn't be easy. The night before the sale was finalized, sleep eluded me. I quietly got up and wandered through the house, touching the walls and furniture, remembering every moment spent there. Part of me felt sad about leaving my grandmother's house, regardless of the reason. But when the sun began to rise over the horizon, bathing the courtyard in golden light, I felt a wave of peace and certainty wash over me. While this house was indeed a gift from my grandmother, the real gift was the strength and determination I had found within myself. That morning, I carefully selected my outfit, choosing a suit that made me feel powerful and confident. I took a deep breath and left my room. The time had come to reveal my secret plan and show them the shocking turn our lives were about to take. As I descended the stairs, I could feel each beat of my heart. It was time to reclaim my life, my freedom, and my future. The house was unnaturally quiet, as if even the walls knew something momentous was about to happen. Robert was reading the newspaper in the living room while Deborah and Nicole were arguing about a TV show. None of them had any idea their lives were about to change dramatically. I stood in the doorway, took a deep breath, and announced in a clear, strong voice that I had something to tell them. Robert slowly lowered his newspaper while Deborah and Nicole stopped their conversation, staring at me with mixed expressions of surprise and contempt. When Robert asked what was wrong, his voice carried an edge of irritation. I took another deep breath, feeling adrenaline coursing through my veins. This was the moment I had been preparing for weeks. There was no turning back now. In a firm voice, I announced that the house had been sold. I told them they would all have to leave within a week. The effect of my words was immediate and dramatic. Robert, Deborah, and Nicole's faces turned pale, and the air grew so thick you could hear the wall clock ticking. Robert was the first to react, jumping up so quickly his newspaper fell to the floor. He demanded to know what I was talking about, insisting that I couldn't sell the house on my own as it was our home. I kept my composure as I explained that this had never really been our home, but rather my inheritance from my grandmother, which I had now sold. Deborah stood up, her face contorted with anger, declaring that this was ridiculous and that they couldn't be thrown out because they were family. Looking straight into her eyes, I told her they had stopped being my family the moment they tried to take my house from me. Nicole, who had been silent until then, began to cry, asking where they would go and what would happen to her children. For a moment, I felt guilty. But then I remembered how they had tried to manipulate me, invade my space, and control my life, and my resolve strengthened. I couldn't keep the coldness from my voice as I told Nicole I was sorry, but that wasn't my problem, reminding her that they had months to find another place to live. Robert approached me, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. He told me I couldn't do this, that I didn't have the right. I pulled an envelope from my bag and replied that it was quite the opposite, I had every right. I opened the envelope and spread out the property deed and recent sale documents on the coffee table before their shocked eyes. Calmly, I explained that the house was solely in my name and I had the complete legal right to sell it, which was exactly what I had done. Robert picked up the documents with trembling hands, his eyes frantically scanning the legal text while Deborah and Nicole peered over his shoulders, their expressions growing more fearful by the second. Robert mumbled that this couldn't be legal. I assured him that it absolutely was. I told them I had consulted with the best lawyer in town and that the sale was completely legal and binding. Deborah, recovering from her initial shock, turned to me with venomous eyes. She accused me of being ungrateful, her voice trembling as she mentioned all they had done for me. I felt years of suppressed anger finally surfacing as I repeated her words about what they had done for me. My voice grew louder with each word as I recounted how they had invaded my home, tried to push me out, looked down on me, and treated me like an outsider in Robert's life. All the frustration and resentment of years poured out as I told them. They had done nothing but make me feel small and insignificant, but that was over now. Robert looked up from the documents with a defeated expression. He pleaded with me, saying we should talk and that there must be a way to cancel the sale. I shook my head, telling him there was nothing to discuss as the sale was final and the new owners would take possession in a week. Deborah approached me, her face twisted with anger, insisting they were my family, and I couldn't do this. I stepped back and reminded her that they had stopped being my family the moment they decided their needs were more important than mine, the moment they tried to take everything from me. I turned to Robert, who was staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and despair. I pulled another envelope from my bag, telling him I had something else for him. I explained these were divorce papers, and I had already signed them. Robert took the envelope with trembling hands. He begged me, insisting there must be another way to resolve this. I told him no, that I needed this divorce for myself. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with suppressed emotions and shifting realities. I could see understanding slowly dawning on their faces, disbelief turning to shock, then to a mixture of anger and fear. I broke the silence by telling them they had 1 week to leave. I added that if they didn't leave within a week, I would have no choice but to take legal action. Robert repeated the words legal action in a faint voice, reminding me we were family, and asking if I was serious. I told him I was completely serious and that they were no longer my family. Deborah had been unusually quiet, but suddenly she exploded in fury, calling me ungrateful and accusing me of leaving them homeless. Robert looked up from the divorce papers with disbelief and declared defiantly that he wouldn't sign them, insisting I couldn't force him to divorce me. I acknowledged that while I couldn't force him to sign, I warned him that if he chose to fight this in court, I would fight back with everything I had. I reminded him that I had evidence of how he had tried to take my inheritance and allowed his family to mistreat me, asking if he really wanted all of that made public. I could see the fear in his eyes, knowing how much he valued his reputation and that the threat of a public scandal was something he couldn't ignore. I told him he had until the weekend, explaining that if he signed the divorce papers and left quietly, we could end this peacefully. I let my unfinished threat hang in the air. I could see the emotions conflicting on their faces: anger, fear, disbelief, and finally, defeat. Deborah's voice trembled as she protested that it couldn't end this way, but I could tell she knew they had lost. I simply told her that yes, this was indeed the end. With those words, I walked out of the room. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear their chaos below: Deborah shouting, Nicole crying, and Robert trying to calm them down. I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, feeling my legs trembling. I had done it. After months of planning and preparation, I had finally taken control of my life. I walked to the window and looked down at the courtyard, where the afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow on the tiles. For a moment, I felt nostalgic, remembering this was my house, my grandmother's legacy. But then I remembered her letter's words and smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude toward her. She had given me more than just a house. She had given me the strength to fight for myself. The next few days were busy. Robert and his family, realizing they had no choice, began packing their belongings. I watched them move around the house like ghosts, avoiding my eyes and whispering among themselves. Robert tried to talk to me several times over those last days. He alternated between pleading and threatening, but I remained firm. On the night before the deadline, he finally handed me the signed divorce papers. With bitterness in his voice, he asked if I was satisfied now, and accused me of destroying our family. I looked at him, with a mixture of sadness and determination in my heart. I told him that he and his family had destroyed everything themselves, while I was simply rebuilding my life. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the front door closing. Looking out the window, I watched Robert's car, loaded with suitcases and boxes, disappear down the street. They were finally gone. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step feeling like my first step into a new world. The house felt quiet and somehow larger than before. I walked through each room, touching the furniture and looking at the photographs on the walls. When I reached the courtyard, I sat by the fountain and listened to the gentle sound of flowing water. I took out my phone and dialed the number. I told the real estate agent they had left and the house was ready for the new owners. As I discussed the final details of the sale, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. I had won back not just the legal battle, but my entire life. That evening, while packing my belongings, I found an old photograph of my grandmother. It was the one that had always sat on her bedside table. I held the photo, gazing at her smiling face. I whispered to her that I had done it, that I had become strong just as she had taught me. The next morning, I loaded my car, signed the final sale papers, and made one last walk through the house. Each room whispered memories, but they no longer held me captive. As I stepped out of the front door for the last time, I paused and looked back. This house that had once been my prison had become a symbol of my liberation. I smiled as I closed the door and walked to my car. As I drove toward the city I had chosen for my fresh start, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The money from the house sale would give me the freedom to chase my dreams. I would open my own architectural firm, travel, and experience the world in ways I never had before. I left behind the old Kayla, always anxious and compliant, in that house. The new Kayla driving toward the city was strong, determined, and ready to face any challenge life might present.